The world held its breath. Engines roared like thunder rolling closer. Banners of blood-red cloth tore against the wind. And with that, the silence of peace was shattered forever. It is 1939, but the air feels ancient, like a storm that has been building for centuries. Wars had come before. Millions had already bled in the mud of the Great War. The world swore never again. But never was short-lived. Europe was not at peace. Europe was a powder keg. And the match had already been struck. Blitzkrieg. The word itself would terrify a generation. Lightning war. A strategy built on speed, fire, and terror. Cities crumbled in days. Nations fell in weeks. Civilians fled with only what they could carry, the skies above them screaming with bombers. The world was about to witness a conflict so vast, so total, that it would devour entire continents. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia. From the jungles of Burma to the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. Every corner of the earth would ignite. It would be fought with tanks and planes, spies and codebreakers, propaganda and genocide. 6 years. 60 million dead. The most destructive war in human history. This is not just the story of armies and battles. It is the story of humanity at its darkest. And its most defiant. The world was about to be torn apart. And nothing would ever be the same. This is the entire history of World War II. The Second World War did not erupt in a vacuum. It was not born in a single night, nor from a single man's ambition. It was the product of decades of anger, betrayal, hunger, and revenge. To understand the scale of this war, the war that scorched the earth between 1939 and 1945, we must first feel the weight of its origins. Europe after World War I was a graveyard with scars that ran deeper than the trenches. 20 million dead. Empires shattered. Maps redrawn with shaky hands in Versailles. The victors of 1919 celebrated their triumph, but the peace treaty left Germany shackled, humiliated, and furious. Reparations crushed its economy. Soldiers returned home to nothing. Inflation ate savings like fire consumes paper. Proud veterans stood in bread lines, medals clinking uselessly against empty stomachs. Out of this despair, whispers of vengeance began to rise. Whispers that grew louder in beer halls and rallies, louder still in the speeches of a failed artist from Austria. His name would soon be cursed by history, Adolf Hitler. But the storm was not confined to Germany alone. Italy, too, under Mussolini, dreamed of empire, marching under black banners. Japan, hungry for resources, cast its gaze upon China and the Pacific. The world was still fragile from the Great Depression. Democracies were wavering. Dictators promised strength, order, destiny. Crowds cheered. Arms factories roared back to life. The drums of war were already beating long before the first shot was fired. Yet many refused to see it. The League of Nations, meant to prevent another world war, was a paper shield. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the world issued words, not weapons. When Mussolini's troops poured poison gas on Ethiopia, the world looked away. When Hitler rearmed, remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, tore Czechoslovakia apart, again the world hesitated. Appeasement was the word of the day. Give him what he wants, leaders thought, and maybe he will stop. But ambition never stops. And so, on September 1, 1939, the illusion shattered. At dawn, German panzers stormed into Poland. Stuka dive bombers screamed from the skies, their sirens designed to freeze the blood of soldiers and civilians alike. By September 3, Britain and France declared war. Once again, Europe was aflame. The conflict spread like wildfire. Nations fell like dominoes: Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. By the summer of 1940, Nazi banners flew over Paris. Britain stood alone, defiant, an island fortress bracing against the storm. Across the seas, America watched, hesitant, still haunted by the graves of the last war. But history was already pulling it toward the fire. This war would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was not limited to trenches and front lines. It was fought in the skies above London, in the alleys of Warsaw, in the factories of Detroit and Berlin, in the whispers of spies passing coded messages in cafes. Civilians became targets. Children became refugees. Entire populations were rounded up, deported, annihilated. It was a war of machines. Tanks thundering across plains, aircraft carriers projecting power across oceans, rockets raining death from the stratosphere. But it was also a war of ideas. Democracy against fascism, freedom against tyranny, survival against extermination. The scale was staggering. Armies moved in millions. Casualties were counted in tens of millions. The Holocaust, history's most industrialized slaughter, would stain the conscience of humanity forever. And yet, amid the fire, there was courage. Partisans blowing up trains in occupied Europe, soldiers digging in at Stalingrad, civilians refusing to bow even as bombs reduced their cities to rubble. The story of World War II is not just a history, it is a warning. It shows how fragile peace can be, how quickly hatred can metastasize, how ordinary men and women can be swept into catastrophe. It is a tale of monstrous cruelty and extraordinary resilience. And it unfolds like a storm, each gust more violent than the last. The invasion of Poland was only the opening shot. The war would spiral outward, to the deserts of North Africa, the frozen Russian front, the jungles of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands where Marines fought inch by inch, wave by wave. The world was split in two, the Axis and the Allies. Each move, each battle, would drag new nations into the abyss. And with every step, the stakes rose higher. By the time it ended, in August 1945, cities would lie in ashes. Nuclear fire would scorch Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Old empires would collapse, and new superpowers would rise from the ruins. The world map would be redrawn once more, but this time, with scars so deep they would define the entire century. This is the journey we are about to take. From the first sparks of aggression to the final mushroom clouds. From Blitzkrieg to D-Day, from Pearl Harbor to Stalingrad, from the rise of Hitler to his fall in a Berlin bunker. The entire history of World War II, told as it truly was, brutal, desperate, unstoppable. And it begins now. The Great War had ended, but the peace was poisoned. In 1919, the victors gathered in Versailles, inside gilded halls built by kings. They came to dictate terms, to bind Germany in chains, to ensure the war to end all wars truly ended. Yet what they created was not peace. It was a wound festering, waiting to reopen. The Treaty of Versailles carved humiliation into Germany's very soul. War guilt. That was the phrase. An entire nation forced to accept blame for a war that had consumed the world. Reparations bled the German treasury dry, demanding sums so vast that entire generations would be burdened. Industry staggered. Jobs vanished. Families watched their savings crumble to dust. A wheelbarrow of marks bought only a loaf of bread. Paper money piled up in the streets, worthless, a mockery of survival. The people were furious. Veterans returned from the trenches broken, haunted, their honor discarded by the very nation they had fought for. Politicians in Berlin shouted across shattered parliaments, unable to heal the wound. Instead, anger metastasized. Nationalism whispered through the streets. Blame was cast, on leaders, on foreigners, on minorities. The Republic trembled. Elsewhere, the world was also cracking. The Russian Empire had collapsed into revolution. The Bolsheviks had risen from the chaos, painting the map with red banners, declaring a new order that terrified the West. Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt cheated, a mutilated victory. Benito Mussolini seized that grievance and molded it into fascism, promising greatness restored. Japan, an empire hungry for land and resources, eyed China like a predator studying prey. The so-called peace was nothing but an illusion, a fragile glass, already spiderwebbed with cracks. And then the Great Depression struck. A financial storm unleashed from Wall Street in 1929, its shockwaves circled the globe. Factories closed. Unemployment soared. Families scavenged for food. Democracies faltered under the weight of desperation. People no longer wanted compromise, They wanted salvation. And salvation often wears the mask of tyranny. Germany, broken and bitter, was fertile ground. From the beer halls of Munich, a voice rose. Fierce, theatrical, mesmerizing. Adolf Hitler. He promised revival, strength, vengeance. His words were fire. Crowds listened, rapt, as he spoke of betrayal, of enemies within, of destiny denied. He did not speak of peace. He spoke of war as redemption. The swastika unfurled. Stormtroopers marched. And a nation beaten to its knees began to rise in dangerous defiance. But in those early years, the world looked away. Britain and France clung to fragile hopes of stability. America turned inward, gripped by its own economic despair. No one wanted another war. Not so soon. Not after the last one had turned Europe into a graveyard. And so dictators moved unchecked. Japan struck first. In 1931, its armies thundered into Manchuria, seizing territory with brutal efficiency. The League of Nations condemned, but its words were hollow. Mussolini watched. Hitler watched. They understood the truth. The guardians of peace were powerless. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. Soon, democracy in Germany was ashes. The Reichstag burned. Civil liberties vanished. Opponents were crushed, silenced, disappeared. Books burned in bonfires. The swastika became law. Germany began to rearm, secretly at first, then openly, brazenly. The shackles of Versailles were snapping. Yet still, the world did not act. Leaders whispered. He only wants fairness, stability, respect. Appeasement was born not out of weakness, but fear. Fear of another war. Fear of repeating the slaughter of the trenches. But Hitler was not seeking fairness. He was preparing a storm. Across Europe, the atmosphere grew electric. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, using poison gas on villages while the world watched. In Spain, civil war erupted. Fascist and communist forces clashed in a brutal rehearsal of what was to come. German planes bombed the town of Guernica, reducing it to rubble, while Picasso painted its agony onto canvas. Volunteers from around the world came to fight, sensing that Spain was not just a civil war. It was the first battlefield of a greater conflict. The shadows deepened. The axis began to form: Berlin, Rome, Tokyo. Three nations bound by ambition, aggression, and a shared hunger for empire. The democracies, weary and fractured, failed to match their ferocity. Austria was the first victim. In 1938, the Anschluss unfolded. German troops marched into Vienna, greeted not with bullets but with flowers. The world did nothing. Then came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, desperate to preserve peace, flew to Munich. He returned with a piece of paper, waving it before the cameras. Peace for our time. The world breathed a sigh of relief. But it was an illusion. 6 months later, Hitler swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia whole. Chamberlain's paper was worthless. The shadows of Versailles had grown into a gathering storm. The lessons of 1919 were clear. Humiliation breeds vengeance. Weakness invites aggression. And still, leaders hesitated. Still, they hoped the storm might pass them by. But history does not wait for the fearful. In Berlin, Hitler's eyes turned eastward. Toward Poland. Toward the next domino. Toward the spark that would ignite the inferno. The world was standing on the edge. The question was no longer if war would come, but when. The interwar years were a breeding ground for monsters. When democracy faltered, dictatorship marched in. When hunger gnawed at the people, strong men promised bread. And when humiliation stung a nation's pride, tyrants offered revenge. Adolf Hitler was not the only man clawing his way to power in the 1920s and 30s. He was part of a grim chorus. Each voice carried its own rhythm of hatred, ambition, and promise of rebirth. Together, they would drag the world into a new abyss. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already set the template. He called it fascism, a creed of iron discipline, national glory, and expansionist dreams. His black shirts, paramilitary thugs dressed in black uniforms, beat opponents in the streets, silenced newspapers, and intimidated parliaments into submission. By 1922, Mussolini had marched on Rome. The king folded. Italy had its dictator. Mussolini spoke of restoring the glory of Rome, of creating a modern empire. The crowds adored him. The trains ran on time. And in the shadows, the blueprint for future tyrants was written. Hitler studied Mussolini's every move. He admired the spectacle, the rallies, the uniforms, the theater of power. But Hitler's vision went further, darker. His speeches were not just about empire, but about purification. A nation reborn not only through conquest, but through exclusion, through extermination. He named scapegoats, Jews, communists, foreigners, traitors from within. His voice rose in stadiums packed with tens of thousands, banners draped like rivers of blood. To his followers, he was not just a politician, he was salvation incarnate. Meanwhile, far to the east, Japan was charting its own course of domination. The military had gripped the emperor's government by the throat. Generals and admirals dictated policy, and their gaze turned toward China's vast resources. Japan, a rising power with limited land, hungered for oil, steel, and coal. Expansion became survival. In 1937, the Japanese army unleashed hell on Nanking. The city was ravaged in a storm of blood. Civilians slaughtered, women violated, a river of corpses flowing beneath the rising sun banner. The world shuddered, but again it did little. And in the Soviet Union, another figure loomed, Joseph Stalin. Not a fascist, but every bit as ruthless. His purges wiped out rivals, officers, even ordinary peasants. Millions starved in engineered famines. The gulags filled with broken bodies. Yet Stalin's industrial drive transformed the USSR into a military titan. His shadow stretched across Eastern Europe, even as Hitler's swastika spread across the West. The stage was filling with dictators, each feeding off the weakness of democracies, each pushing boundaries further. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, sending German troops into territory forbidden by Versailles. French forces could have crushed them with ease. But France did nothing. Britain issued protests. Hitler laughed. Every gamble emboldened him. Every silence confirmed his belief. The world was too cowardly to resist. The dictators watched one another. Mussolini tested the waters in Ethiopia, and when no one stopped him, Hitler understood he could push harder. Franco's Spain erupted in civil war. Fascists versus Republicans. Hitler and Mussolini sent planes, tanks, troops. Stalin sent aid to the Republicans. The rest of the world looked on nervously, unwilling to intervene directly. Spain became a bloody rehearsal. Cities bombed from the air, civilians targeted, propaganda spread like wildfire. The war was not yet global, but it was learning how to be. By the late 1930s, Hitler's appetite was no longer hidden. The Anschluss in Austria came first, German troops marching in without resistance, greeted with flowers and cheers. Then Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland. At Munich in 1938, Neville Chamberlain bargained with Hitler. The British Prime Minister returned declaring, "Peace for our time," waving a piece of paper that promised stability. But it was a mirage. Hitler devoured the rest of Czechoslovakia within months. Chamberlain's paper was ash in his hands. Still, dictators thrived because fear ruled their enemies. Britain and France remembered 1914. They remembered 4 years of mud and blood. They would do anything, to avoid repeating it. That reluctance gave Hitler everything he needed. By 1939, the dictators no longer merely tested boundaries. They carved the world. Mussolini boasted of a new Roman Empire. Japan tightened its grip on China, eyeing Southeast Asia's resources. Stalin signed death warrants for millions while preparing the Red Army. And Hitler prepared for the ultimate gamble, Poland. But before striking, Hitler stunned the world with one final act of cunning. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between two sworn enemies. The world gasped. But hidden within the pact was a secret protocol, the division of Poland and Eastern Europe between them. Stalin and Hitler, two predators circling the same prey, had agreed to feast together. It was the last piece, the last domino. When Hitler's armies rolled into Poland on September 1st, 1939, it was no longer a question of appeasement. Britain and France declared war 2 days later. But the dictators had already rewritten the rules. War was no longer looming. War had arrived. The rise of dictators had tipped the world into darkness. And the first strike was about to ignite the greatest inferno in history. The world braced. The shadows of Versailles had grown into thunder. The age of dictators had begun. And soon, the world would burn. Dawn. September 1st, 1939. The sky over Poland split open with fire. German planes screamed overhead, Stukas diving toward rail stations, bridges, and cities. Their sirens shrieked like banshees, a sound engineered to freeze blood. On the ground, German panzers thundered forward. Tanks rolled like steel beasts, crushing fences, smashing barricades, leaving only churned earth behind. Soldiers marched in precise, endless columns. The invasion had begun. Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. It was not just a tactic, it was a revolution. No slow-moving trenches like in 1914. No grinding stalemates of attrition. Blitzkrieg was speed, coordination, terror. First, the Luftwaffe blasted the skies. Then, armored columns sliced through defenses. Infantry followed, encircling, overwhelming, cutting off retreat. The enemy never had time to breathe. Poland, brave but unprepared, resisted with everything it had. Cavalry units charged against tanks, sabers flashing in a hopeless bid to stall the juggernaut. Polish soldiers fought desperately at Westerplatte, holding out for 7 days under relentless bombardment. Civilians filled sandbags, fled burning villages, or were caught in the storm of fire raining from the skies. Warsaw itself became a fortress, refusing to surrender as bombs reduced it to rubble. But the odds were impossible. Germany had planned this invasion with ruthless precision. Communications were severed. Railroads destroyed. Encirclements snapped shut like jaws. By mid-September, the Polish army was splintered, fighting in isolated pockets, surrounded on all sides. And then the final betrayal. On September 17th, Soviet troops poured into eastern Poland. Stalin, bound by the secret pact with Hitler, claimed his half of the spoils. Poland was carved apart, crushed between two predators. The dream of independence drowned in blood and fire. For the world, it was a shocking lesson. Hitler had gambled that Britain and France would not act decisively. But this time they declared war. On September 3, 1939, the words were spoken. Britain and France were at war with Germany. Crowds cheered, but behind the cheers was dread. Everyone remembered 1914. Everyone remembered the price. Yet for weeks, little happened on the Western Front. Troops mobilized, trenches were dug, but the guns stayed silent. It was called the phony war. To some, it seemed a strange lull. To others, it was terror, waiting for a storm they knew would come. But for Poland, there was no lull. The storm never ended. The country was dismembered, its people enslaved. The Nazis began their reign of terror, executing intellectuals, priests, and leaders in Operation Tannenberg. The Soviets deported hundreds of thousands to Siberia. In 1940, the Katyn massacre would follow, with thousands of Polish officers executed in cold blood by Stalin's men. The Polish state was erased from the map. And yet, Poland did not vanish. Its soldiers escaped, fighting on with the Allies. Its pilots would soon defend Britain's skies. Its government in exile set up in London, refusing to surrender. Poland had fallen, but its spirit burned on. The invasion of Poland showed the world the future of warfare. Blitzkrieg was unstoppable, a machine of shock and speed that stunned the old generals who still dreamed of trench lines. The world had stepped into a new kind of war, one faster, deadlier, and more merciless than anything before. And Hitler was only just beginning. The fall of Poland was not the end. It was the fuse. The war was spreading. And next, the storm would roll west. Winter passed with unease. The phony war, they called it. British and French soldiers dug trenches along the Maginot Line, a concrete fortress stretching across France's eastern border. They waited in the cold, rifles in hand, listening to the silence. No great battles erupted. No massive offensives began. Newspapers mocked the stillness, as if war were a bluff. But beneath the surface, Hitler was sharpening the blade. And in May 1940, he struck. German armies exploded westward. The Blitzkrieg was unleashed again, this time against Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately France. It was war as lightning. In Denmark, the invasion lasted just 6 hours. Norway held longer, but its fjords burned with gunfire and falling cities. Then came the Low Countries. German paratroopers dropped from the skies. Bridges seized. Airfields captured. Armored divisions surged forward. Civilians awoke to the roar of planes overhead. Their streets turned to rubble by sudden airstrikes. France and Britain scrambled to respond. They sent troops north, expecting a repeat of World War I. They believed the Germans would attack through Belgium, across the same plains where millions had once died. And they were right, but only partly. The real dagger came through the Ardennes. Thick forests. Narrow roads. Terrain the French generals considered impassable for tanks. But Hitler gambled. His panzers pushed through, grinding past hills, trees, and rivers. In days, they emerged behind the Allied armies. The trap slammed shut. It was shock and chaos. Entire divisions cut off. Communications collapsed. Refugees clogged the roads, families with carts, bicycles, children in tow, slowing soldiers trying to retreat. The Luftwaffe strafed them mercilessly, turning escape routes into killing fields. French towns burned one after another. The German war machine was not stopping. It was accelerating. By late May, British and French forces were encircled near Dunkirk. The sea was their only escape. The beaches became an apocalyptic scene. Tens of thousands of soldiers huddled in the sand, German artillery closing in, planes screaming overhead. And then came Operation Dynamo, the miracle of Dunkirk. Fishing boats, yachts, ferries, and warships alike crossed the channel. Under fire, they evacuated over 300,000 men. Britain would live to fight another day. But France was breaking. The German advance rolled southward. Paris declared itself an open city, unwilling to see its treasures destroyed. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe, their boots echoing on cobblestones. The world gasped at the sight. Paris, fallen in weeks. The French government capitulated. The nation was divided. The north occupied by Germany, the south governed by a puppet regime in Vichy under Marshal Pétain. France, once the great power of Europe, lay in chains. For Hitler, it was triumph. He stood before the Eiffel Tower, photographed in smug victory. In Compiègne, he staged revenge. In the very railway carriage where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918, he forced the French to sign theirs. History had come full circle, but this time, the humiliation was France's. The fall of France stunned the world. Britain now stood alone against the Nazi tide. Across the Channel, Churchill vowed defiance, declaring he would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, never surrender. But behind his words, the reality was grim. Europe was Nazi territory. The swastika flew from Norway to Spain's border. The Wehrmacht looked invincible. Hitler turned his eyes to the next prize. Britain, the island fortress. The last barrier before total domination of Western Europe. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Would Britain fall in 6 days? The answer would come in the skies. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Summer 1940. Europe was conquered. France had fallen. The swastika hung over Paris. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, all crushed. Across the Channel, Britain now stood as the last free nation in Western Europe. Alone. Isolated. Facing the full weight of Hitler's war machine. The world waited for Britain to collapse. Hitler expected it. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. But before an invasion could begin, one obstacle stood in his way: the Royal Air Force. The skies over Britain had to be destroyed. Only then could Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the island, be unleashed. And so began the Battle of Britain. At dawn, the Luftwaffe crossed the channel in waves. Bombers droned like swarms of wasps, their escorts, Messerschmitt fighters, darting like hawks. Their targets, radar stations, airfields, factories, cities. Britain's defenses were tested daily, hourly, relentlessly. The skies filled with contrails and fire. The roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the boom of explosions. It was a war above the clouds. The British pilots were young, many barely out of school. They flew Spitfires and Hurricanes, sleek machines rising to meet the storm. They called them the few. Winston Churchill's phrase immortalized them. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Day after day, they scrambled into the skies, intercepting incoming raids, dueling German fighters in furious dogfights. It was not just bravery, it was technology, too. Britain had built a secret weapon, radar. Stations along the coast detected incoming waves of bombers before they arrived, giving the RAF precious minutes to prepare. It was the edge they needed against an enemy that outnumbered them. The battle was merciless. Pilots burned alive in their cockpits. Parachutes drifted over fields, some landing safely, others riddled with bullets. Civilians on the ground watched dogfights unfold above their villages, the sky littered with smoke and falling wreckage. Children cheered when RAF planes roared past, only to cower as bombs fell moments later. Hitler expected quick victory. He was wrong. The RAF would not break. Britain would not bow. The Germans shifted tactics. When airfields held, they turned to terror. In September 1940, the Blitz began. London was bombed night after night. Coventry burned. Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, all pounded into rubble. Civilians huddled in underground stations, listening to the rumble of destruction above. Families emerged in the morning to find their homes gone, their streets reduced to dust and twisted steel. But instead of breaking Britain's will, the bombs hardened it. Londoners swept glass from their windows and went to work. Fire brigades battled infernos all night, then reported to factories in the morning. Defiance became routine. The message was clear: Britain would not surrender. In the skies, the RAF held. Outnumbered, exhausted, but unyielding. They fought with everything, sometimes flying 3-4 sorties a day. Losses were heavy, but so were Germany's. By October, the Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority. Operation Sea Lion was postponed, then abandoned. The invasion of Britain would never come. The Battle of Britain was the first great turning point of the war. For the first time, Hitler had been stopped. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had met its match. Britain stood bloodied but unbroken, an island fortress against the tide. Yet while Britain celebrated survival, the storm was far from over. Hitler still dreamed of conquest. He looked across the channel and snarled, but his eyes soon turned elsewhere, eastward, toward Russia. But before he struck the Soviet Union, another storm brewed. Across the seas, a rising empire watched closely. Japan. Its ambitions in Asia would soon bring America into the war. For now, Britain had survived the Battle of the Skies. But the Blitz had only just begun, and the night war over Britain was far from finished. Night. Sirens wailed. Londoners dropped everything and ran for cover. Children clutched gas masks. Families scrambled into the underground, transforming train platforms into bunkers. Above them, the sky glowed red. The Blitz had begun. From September 1940 through May 1941, Britain endured one of the most relentless bombing campaigns in history. The Luftwaffe shifted strategy. If the Royal Air Force could not be destroyed in the skies, perhaps the British spirit could be crushed on the ground. Cities would burn. Civilians would break. That was the plan. But the bombs did not bring surrender. They brought defiance. London was the prime target. Every night, waves of German bombers droned overhead. Incendiaries rained down, igniting whole districts. Explosions tore through streets, ripping buildings apart, leaving firestorms in their wake. The city's skyline, once proud with cathedrals and bridges, now glowed like a furnace. The Thames reflected the flames. St. Paul's Cathedral stood defiant amid the smoke, a symbol of endurance. But it was not just London. Coventry, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool. Industrial heartlands were pounded into rubble. The Blitz was designed to cripple war production. Instead, it hardened it. Factories rebuilt overnight. Women welded steel and packed munitions as bombs fell only streets away. In the morning after raids, workers arrived at their posts, soot still on their faces. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands killed. Millions made homeless. Families dug loved ones from the wreckage with their bare hands. Yet even in the darkest nights, resilience shone. Neighbors shared food and shelters. Children played among the ruins by day. Fire wardens and ambulance drivers braved collapsing buildings to save the trapped. The Blitz created a rhythm of terror. Nights of sirens, bombs, and fire. Days of digging, rebuilding, enduring. But Hitler miscalculated. Instead of breaking morale, the bombs united Britain. Defiance became national identity. Churchill's speeches echoed across radios. "We shall never surrender." And the people believed him, because every night they proved it. The Luftwaffe paid dearly. Night raids were dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire filled the skies. Searchlights cut beams through darkness, exposing bombers to destruction. RAF night fighters adapted, intercepting enemy squadrons. Losses mounted. The German Air Force could not sustain the campaign. By May 1941, the Blitz began to fade. Hitler's focus shifted eastward. Britain had endured. Its cities scarred, its people weary, but unbroken. Yet the war was changing. The Blitz had proven that civilians were no longer bystanders. They were targets, combatants in their own way, part of total war. The line between front lines and home had vanished. The world had entered a new age of conflict. For Britain, survival was victory. But survival alone could not win the war. Supplies dwindled. The Atlantic convoys, lifelines of food, fuel, and weapons from America, were under attack by German U-boats. The seas were as deadly as the skies. Britain stood alone, battered, starving, waiting for allies. Across the Atlantic, America was not yet in the war. But it was watching. President Roosevelt sent aid through the Lend-Lease program. Ships loaded with supplies crossing waters haunted by wolf packs of submarines. Britain clung to this lifeline. Without it, the island fortress would starve. The Blitz ended, but the war did not relent. Instead, it grew larger, darker. The Atlantic boiled with battles. North Africa burned with new campaigns. And in the East, Hitler was preparing his greatest gamble yet, an invasion that would dwarf all before it. Britain had endured the fire from above. But the next storm would make the Blitz look small. The war was about to spread across the world. The war spread south. The sands of North Africa, vast and merciless, became a new battlefield. Here, in a land of scorching sun and endless dunes, tanks clashed like warships at sea, maneuvering across deserts where mirages shimmered on the horizon. Italy struck first. In 1940, Mussolini's forces crossed from Libya into Egypt, seeking to seize the Suez Canal, the lifeline of Britain's empire, connecting Europe to Asia, oil fields, and colonies. Mussolini boasted of restoring Roman glory, but his army was ill-prepared, poorly equipped, and stretched thin. The British struck back with astonishing speed. Operation Compass. In a daring counteroffensive, General Richard O'Connor's forces smashed through Italian lines. 10 divisions were destroyed. Thousands of prisoners captured. Entire armies melted in the desert sun. By early 1941, Italy's dream of conquest was in tatters. Mussolini's pride was shattered. But Hitler would not let his ally fall alone. From Germany came a name that would echo across the desert like a legend, Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox. Commanding the Afrika Korps, Rommel arrived in Libya with cunning tactics and unrelenting energy. He turned retreat into advance. His panzers struck like lightning, outflanking, encircling, driving the British back across hundreds of miles. By April 1941, the tide had reversed. The Desert War was a pendulum, swinging back and forth with each campaign. The battles of North Africa were unlike Europe's wars. No cities. No forests. just sand, heat, and endless horizon. Tanks became the kings of the battlefield, maneuvering in sweeping arcs across open desert. Aircraft screamed overhead, strafing supply convoys. Logistics, fuel, water, food were as vital as bullets. Soldiers endured scorching days and freezing nights, sandstorms that blinded, thirst that killed as surely as bullets. Civilians too suffered. Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia became battlegrounds, their people caught between armies. Villages were raided, fields destroyed, families displaced. War's shadow fell on ancient lands. By late 1941, Britain's new commander arrived, General Bernard Montgomery. Where Rommel was daring and improvisational, Montgomery was disciplined, methodical, and cautious. Their clash would define the Desert War. The decisive moment came at El Alamein. October 1942. The desert shook with artillery. British tanks, infantry, and air power battered German-Italian lines. Rommel, brilliant but overstretched, could not hold. After 12 days of ferocious combat, his forces retreated westward. Churchill declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." El Alamein was a turning point. The tide was shifting. The Allies pressed forward, pushing the Axis across Libya. And then came Operation Torch, an audacious Allied landing in Morocco and Algeria. American troops entered the war in North Africa, joining British forces in a two-pronged assault. The desert became a trap. Rommel's Africa Corps was squeezed between Montgomery advancing from the east and the Americans from the west. By May 1943, the Axis in Africa collapsed. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. An entire army gone. The desert inferno had burned itself out. But North Africa was more than a theater of war. It was a gateway. With Africa secured, the Allies now had a launch pad to strike Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. The Mediterranean would blaze next. For Hitler, the loss was a humiliation. For Mussolini, it was disaster. For the Allies, it was hope. The war had begun to turn. Yet while the desert burned, another front was exploding thousands of miles away. In the east, Japan was on the march. Asia trembled as the rising sun cast its shadow wider. The war was no longer European. It was global. And the next flashpoint would erupt in the Pacific. While Europe burned, Asia was already in flames. Japan's empire had grown restless. Its generals saw the Pacific not as an ocean, but as a road to dominance. And in the late 1930s, Japan began its march across Asia, brutal, relentless, unstoppable. The invasion of China had already revealed Japan's ferocity. In 1937, the Imperial Army stormed Nanking, unleashing one of history's darkest atrocities. Civilians butchered, women violated, tens of thousands murdered in weeks. The city drowned in blood. The world recoiled, but it did not intervene. And Japan pressed on. By 1940, Tokyo's ambition expanded beyond China. Southeast Asia's riches beckoned. Oil in the Dutch East Indies. Rubber in Malaya. Rice and tin across Burma and Indochina. Japan's leaders believed their survival depended on conquest. Asia for Asians, they declared, calling it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But behind the slogan was empire, Japan ruling by the sword. The timing was perfect. Europe's colonial powers were weak. France had fallen. Britain was under siege. Their Asian colonies were exposed. Japan struck swiftly. In September 1940, its forces marched into French Indochina. Bases established. Airfields seized. Step by step, the Japanese noose tightened around Southeast Asia. But one obstacle remained, the United States. Washington protested Japan's aggression. President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets, cut off vital oil supplies. For Japan, it was an ultimatum, retreat or strike. The generals chose strike. Plans formed for a lightning war across the Pacific, aimed at crippling Western power in Asia before it could react. December 1941. The rising sun prepared to ignite the ocean. When Japanese troops advanced into Malaya, their speed stunned British defenses. On bicycles, they pedaled through jungles, bypassing strongholds, cutting off retreat. Air superiority was decisive. Japanese bombers hammered Allied positions relentlessly. In weeks, Singapore, Britain's proud fortress in Asia, was cornered. In February 1942, it fell. 80,000 troops surrendered, the largest capitulation in British history. Churchill called it the worst disaster of the empire. The Dutch East Indies followed. Oil fields seized. Java, Sumatra, Borneo, all swallowed by the Japanese tide. American and Filipino troops fought desperately in the Philippines, but by spring 1942, the islands fell. Bataan surrendered. The infamous Death March began. Tens of thousands of prisoners forced to march in scorching heat without food or water, beaten and executed along the way. Thousands perished. Everywhere, Japan seemed invincible. Its navy, led by carriers, dominated the seas. Its troops conquered territory stretching from Burma to New Guinea, from the Aleutians in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south. An empire spanning millions of square miles had been forged in months. But conquest bred cruelty. Occupied lands groaned under Japan's rule. Civilians enslaved as laborers. Resources stripped. Atrocities repeated, massacres, executions, forced prostitution in comfort stations. Resistance movements grew in jungles and mountains, fueled by rage and survival. Yet the empire's triumph carried a fatal flaw. It had awakened a sleeping giant. The United States, attacked at Pearl Harbor, was now in the war. America's industrial might and manpower would not be easily contained. For now, though, Japan was at its zenith. In Tokyo, leaders celebrated victories. They dreamed of negotiating from a position of strength, forcing the Allies to accept Japanese dominance in Asia. But history was already turning. The rising sun burned bright. Too bright. And soon it would begin to fade. Because the Pacific was about to erupt in battles as vast and ferocious as anything seen in Europe. At sea, in the air, across islands and jungles, the tide would turn. And that turning point was coming. Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. The sun rose over the Hawaiian Islands. Palm trees swayed. Sailors on leave strolled the docks of Pearl Harbor, sipping coffee, writing letters home. A quiet morning. Peaceful. Deceptively so. Then, at 7:55 a.m., the world changed. From the north, a wave of aircraft appeared. 183 Japanese planes, engines roaring. Torpedo bombers skimmed the waves. Dive bombers climbed into the sky. Fighters swarmed like hornets. Their rising sun insignias gleamed in the morning light. The attack was sudden, devastating, unforgiving. The first torpedoes slammed into battleships moored in the harbor. USS Oklahoma capsized, rolling onto its side. USS Arizona erupted in a colossal explosion as its forward magazine ignited. 1,177 men entombed in seconds. Columns of smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. The harbor boiled with fire. Sailors scrambled, some diving into oil-slick waters that burned around them. Anti-aircraft guns barked defiantly, but many were unmanned, locked away for peacetime inspection. Chaos reigned. Planes fell from the sky, both American and Japanese, littering the harbor with wreckage. The attack came in two waves. In 90 minutes, 8 battleships were damaged or sunk. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans killed. It was the single most devastating foreign attack on American soil in history. Yet amid the carnage, there was defiance. The USS Nevada, though hit, attempted to steam out of the harbor under fire. Airmen scrambled to their planes, shooting down attackers despite overwhelming odds. Civilians joined rescue efforts, dragging the wounded from the flames. The Japanese had hoped to cripple America's Pacific Fleet, to buy time for their empire to consolidate its conquests. But they had missed their ultimate target, the aircraft carriers. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea, spared from destruction. And those carriers would soon become the backbone of America's counterstrike. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His words thundered across the nation. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. Congress declared war on Japan. In response, Germany and Italy declared war on America. The global conflict was now truly total. The world's largest industrial power, awakened and enraged, was entering the fight. For Japan, Pearl Harbor was a tactical success, but a strategic catastrophe. They had lit a fire they could not control. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh would roar to life. Millions of men would enlist. Entire fleets would be built in months. America, struck with fury, was on the march. Pearl Harbor was not just an attack. It was an awakening. The sleeping giant had stirred. And the war would never be the same. But America's entry also changed everything for Britain, still battered from the Blitz, and for the Soviet Union, already bracing for Hitler's fury in the East. The Allies were no longer cornered. They had a Titan on their side. The question was no longer if the Axis could be stopped, but how much of the world would burn before they were defeated. And as America mobilized, the Pacific would soon become a graveyard of ships, planes, and men. The tide of war was beginning to turn. Pearl Harbor was the spark, the explosion that shook a nation from hesitation to fury. Within hours of Roosevelt's speech, millions of Americans surged to enlistment offices. Long lines wrapped around city blocks. Young men signed their names with trembling hands, some not yet 18, others leaving jobs, farms, and families behind. They carried one thought: revenge. Factories roared awake. Assembly lines that once built cars now turned out tanks, trucks, and jeeps. Shipyards launched new vessels at staggering speed. Liberty ships built in weeks instead of months. Airplane production soared. Bombers and fighters streamed from hangars like steel swarms. America's industrial muscle flexed, and the world trembled. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of strength, sleeves rolled, arms flexed, rivet gun in hand. They welded ships, packed munitions, flew aircraft as test pilots, proving war was no longer just a man's fight. Across the country, rationing began. Families saved scrap metal, rubber, and fuel. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards. The nation was mobilizing not just its soldiers, but its people. The Pacific, meanwhile, burned. After Pearl Harbor, Japan swept across the map with frightening speed. Guam fell. Wake Island, though defended heroically, was overwhelmed. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. The Philippines, once thought impregnable, staggered under relentless assault. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding U.S. forces in the Philippines, fought bitterly. American and Filipino troops held at Bataan for months, starving, exhausted, yet unyielding. But in April 1942, they could hold no longer. Tens of thousands surrendered. The Bataan Death March followed, 65 miles of horror under a blazing sun, prisoners beaten, bayonet, left to die by the roadside. Thousands perished. MacArthur himself was ordered to evacuate. Before leaving, he spoke words that echoed across the Pacific. "I shall return." To Filipinos, those words became a promise. To Americans, they became a battle cry. Even as Japan's empire expanded, America struck back. In April 1942, the Doolittle raid stunned the world. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, soared over Tokyo. The bombs caused little damage, but the psychological impact was immense. Japan, thought untouchable, had been hit. The raid electrified American morale, a signal that the tide could and would turn. The Pacific became a chessboard of carriers, islands, and fleets. Battles would be decided not by battleships, but by aircraft launched from decks, striking hundreds of miles away. America adapted fast. Its navy reorganized, its tactics sharpened. Training intensified. The sting of Pearl Harbor drove them harder. On the home front, propaganda posters filled walls. Loose lips sink ships. Buy war bonds. Remember Pearl Harbor. Hollywood joined the fight, producing films that rallied patriotism, demonized the enemy, and boosted morale. Every song, every headline, every broadcast reminded Americans that total war demanded total commitment. Yet it was not just soldiers and workers who paid the price. Japanese Americans faced suspicion and fear. Over 100,000 were forced into internment camps, their homes and businesses abandoned. A tragic scar in America's war effort, fear outweighing justice. Still, the nation surged forward, united by a singular purpose: defeat the Axis. By mid-1942, American power was growing. Troops poured into training camps. Fleets patrolled the Pacific. Convoys crossed the Atlantic, braving U-boat attacks to keep Britain alive. The United States was no longer a bystander. It was the arsenal of democracy, the beating heart of the Allied cause. But for all its strength, the road ahead was steep. Japan still dominated Asia. Germany still ruled Europe. Hitler's armies were marching deep into the Soviet Union, threatening Moscow itself. America's awakening had come just in time. The question now was whether it was soon enough. The world held its breath, because the first great clash between America and Japan was coming. A battle that would decide the Pacific's fate. And it would be fought on the waves, at a tiny coral atoll called Midway. The summer of 1942. Hitler's armies surged eastward once more. Operation Barbarossa, launched the year before, had carried the Wehrmacht deep into Soviet lands. Millions of prisoners taken. Entire cities leveled. The Red Army staggered, retreating through scorched earth. But the Soviets had not broken. And Hitler was determined to finish the job. His eyes fixed on the Volga River. On a city bearing the name of his greatest enemy, Stalingrad. The plan was bold. Seize the city, cut Soviet supply lines, secure oil fields of the Caucasus. But more than strategy, it was symbolic. To take Stalin's city was to crush Soviet morale. To Hitler, it was destiny. The assault began in late summer. The Luftwaffe bombed Stalingrad relentlessly, reducing neighborhoods to ash and rubble. Civilians fled into cellars, clinging to survival. Entire districts became firestorms, but the city did not fall. Instead, the ruins became a fortress. The Red Army dug in among the rubble. Snipers perched in shattered buildings. Soldiers fought block by block, room by room, stairwell by stairwell. The battle became a nightmare. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat war. Grenades and knives in the dark. Flamethrowers in basements. Machine guns spraying through holes in walls. A single factory or apartment block could change hands dozens of times in a day. The Volga became a river of death. Soviet reinforcements ferried across under constant bombardment. Men died before even reaching the shore, but still they came. The Soviets clung to their city with desperation. Stalin's order was clear. Not a step back. NKVD troops executed deserters. Soviet generals, Zhukov among them, planned patiently. Every day the Germans bled more, deeper into the trap. As autumn turned to winter, the tide shifted. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets unleashed Operation Uranus. A massive counteroffensive. Red Army divisions struck north and south of Stalingrad, not against the German corps, but against their flanks, held by weaker Romanian and Italian troops. The lines collapsed. Within days, the German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, was encircled. The hunter had become the hunted. Hitler ordered them to stand, to fight to the last man. Supplies dwindled. Food ran out. Ammunition short. The Luftwaffe promised resupply from the air, but the effort was a disaster. Too few planes, too much fire. Winter closed its fist. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze in foxholes, gnawed on horse meat, burned books for warmth. The mighty Sixth Army starved and shivered amid the ruins. Inside the city, the fighting never ceased. Soviet troops pressed harder, house to house, factory to factory. German soldiers, once conquerors, were reduced to skeletons in rags, their faces hollow, their spirit broken. Letters home spoke of hopelessness, of despair. "We are the last Germans," one wrote. By January 1943, the end was near. Soviet artillery pounded relentlessly. Entire divisions vanished. On February 2nd, the last German resistance collapsed. Field Marshal Paulus, newly promoted by Hitler to ensure he would not surrender, did just that. 90,000 broken survivors stumbled into Soviet captivity, out of an army that had once been 300,000. Stalingrad was a graveyard. Over 2 million men had fought. Nearly 2 million were dead, wounded, or captured. Civilians perished in untold numbers. The city itself was rubble, a wasteland of ruins and ash. But it had held. The impact shook the world. For the first time, Hitler's aura of invincibility was shattered. The Wehrmacht had been stopped. Defeated. Humiliated. The Red Army had turned the tide. From this moment on, the Soviet machine would push westward, relentless, unstoppable, until Berlin itself. For the Germans, Stalingrad was disaster. For the Soviets, it was triumph, though bought in rivers of blood. And for the Allies, it was hope, the proof that the Nazi war machine could bleed and could be broken. But while Europe froze in Stalingrad's ruins, far across the ocean, another battle raged. One fought not in snow and rubble, but on the endless waves of the Pacific. And there, too, the tide was about to turn. June 1942. The Pacific was vast, endless, and cruel. Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Aleutians, from the jungles of New Guinea to the islands of the Central Pacific. The rising sun seemed unstoppable. Pearl Harbor had been humiliation. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore was gone. Japan ruled the seas. But the United States was learning, adapting, striking back. The Doolittle raid had shown Japan could be touched. Now the U.S. Navy sought more than a raid. They sought a turning point. That chance came at a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific, Midway. Japan's plan was bold. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aimed to lure the U.S. carriers into a trap. Midway would be the bait. Once the Americans came to defend it, Japan's superior fleet would crush them, ending America's resistance in the Pacific. The empire would be secure. But Yamamoto did not know his secrets were already broken. American cryptographers, working tirelessly at Pearl Harbor's intelligence station, had cracked Japanese codes. They knew Midway was the target. They knew when the attack would come. Admiral Chester Nimitz, calm and calculating, prepared his ambush. On June 4th, the battle erupted. Japanese carriers launched waves of bombers at Midway, striking runways, fuel tanks, and defenses. American pilots scrambled, throwing themselves into the path of the assault. Many flew outdated planes, slow, underarmed. Squadrons were massacred. Torpedo bombers attacked at sea level, only to be slaughtered by Japanese fighters. Dozens of young aviators died without landing a hit. But their sacrifice pulled Japanese defenses downward, leaving the skies open. And then, like fate itself, the moment arrived. From above, U.S. dive bombers descended. The sun at their backs, engines howling, bombs armed. In minutes, the battle turned. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, 3 Japanese carriers, the pride of their fleet, struck by direct hits. Explosions tore through decks loaded with refueling aircraft. Fire engulfed hangars, igniting bombs and fuel. Entire crews burned alive. The carriers, symbols of Japanese might, became floating infernos. Only Hiryu remained. It struck back fiercely, crippling the USS Yorktown. But the Americans found her too. Dive bombers descended once again, delivering fatal blows. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone, along with hundreds of planes and their irreplaceable crews. The ocean was red with fire and oil. Sailors clung to wreckage, the sea around them aflame. Midway had become a graveyard. The cost to the U.S. was heavy. 1 carrier lost, many lives sacrificed. But the scale of victory was staggering. Japan's carrier force, the spearhead of its expansion, was shattered. The empire would never regain the initiative. Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the tide shifted. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken. America now seized the offensive, island by island, battle by battle, across the Pacific. For the men who fought, it was hell in the skies, courage against impossible odds. For history, It was the moment the Pacific War changed course forever. As news of victory spread, America's morale surged. Factories redoubled efforts. New carriers rolled off the docks. The sleeping giant was now fully awake, armed, and relentless. Japan still held vast territories, but its strength had peaked. Its empire was doomed, it just did not know it yet. From the frozen hell of Stalingrad to the flaming seas of Midway, 1942 had delivered 2 hammer blows to the Axis. The momentum was shifting. Slowly, painfully, the Allies were beginning to turn the tide of the war. But war was far from over. Entire continents still burned. Occupied nations resisted in shadows. Armies prepared for new invasions. The struggle would stretch on for 3 more years, claiming millions more lives. The tide had turned, but the storm was still raging. And next, the war would move not just to the battlefields, but to the factories, the streets, the homes of those who lived under its shadow. The guns roared in Africa. The bombs fell on Europe. The fleets clashed in the Pacific. But the war was not only fought on battlefields. It was also fought in cities, towns, and factories, on the home front, where industry became a weapon as powerful as any tank or plane. For the Allies, survival depended not just on soldiers, but on workers. Not just on generals, but on assembly lines. The true arsenal of victory was built far from the front, forged in sweat, steel, and sacrifice. In the United States, the transformation was staggering. Before Pearl Harbor, its factories built cars, radios, refrigerators. After Pearl Harbor, those same factories turned overnight into engines of war. Detroit, once the Motor City, became the arsenal of democracy. Ford's massive Willow Run plant produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Shipyards launched Liberty ships in days, some built so quickly that entire vessels slid into the water before the paint dried. America was not just fighting a war. It was building one at a pace the world had never seen. Women filled the factories, their hair tied in scarves, their hands steady on machines. They became riveters, welders, machinists, the backbone of production. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of strength, a promise that no task was too heavy, no role too great. For many women, it was their first step into the workforce, a seismic change that would echo long after the war ended. Britain, battered by the Blitz, showed equal resolve. London's factories churned out Spitfires and Hurricanes even as bombs fell around them. Workers toiled in blackout conditions, sleeping in shelters, waking to sweep glass from assembly lines before resuming production. Children were evacuated to the countryside, separated from families, so their parents could work without fear. Rationing became a way of life, meat, sugar, fuel carefully divided. Every scrap of metal, every ounce of food, every drop of fuel was precious. In the Soviet Union, the struggle was monumental. As the German armies advanced in 1941, entire factories were dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto trains, and shipped east beyond the Ural Mountains. There, in freezing conditions, under unimaginable hardship, workers reassembled plants and resumed production. Tanks rolled out of Siberian factories, even as their workers fought hunger and cold. It was sacrifice on an industrial scale, a war of endurance and iron. On the other side, Axis powers mobilized too. German industry, directed by Albert Speer after 1942, became brutally efficient. Factories ran day and night, staffed not only by Germans, but by millions of forced laborers dragged from occupied lands. Men, women, even children toiled in chains to feed the Nazi war machine. Japan exploited its conquests, stripping Asia of resources, forcing civilians into labor. Entire populations became cogs in the gears of empire. But the Allies had the advantage of numbers, resources, and coordination. American steel, British resilience, Soviet manpower. Together they forged an industrial storm the Axis could not match. War was no longer just about soldiers with rifles. It was about tanks by the thousands, planes by the tens of thousands, bullets by the billions. Propaganda fueled the effort. Posters urged sacrifice. Loose lips sink ships. Dig for victory. Buy war bonds. In America, Hollywood joined the fight. Movies rallied patriotism, showed soldiers as heroes, painted the war as noble and necessary. Across Allied nations, music, speeches, and slogans kept morale alive. Yet the war at home was not without pain. Families endured separation, with fathers, sons, and brothers gone overseas. Telegrams arrived bearing dreaded words. "We regret to inform you." Cities endured rationing, shortages, blackouts. In America, Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, stripped of rights in the name of security, a wound that scarred the nation. Still, the factories of victory never ceased. They were the unseen battlefront, the foundation upon which armies stood. Every tank at El Alamein, every Spitfire over London, every Sherman on the beaches of Normandy began in the sweat of these workers. Without them, no general, no soldier could have fought. The war at home was total. It demanded everything: time, energy, sacrifice, even lives. And it forged unity. Citizens became soldiers without uniforms, their battlegrounds made of steel, smoke, and assembly lines. By 1943, Allied production dwarfed that of the Axis. For every German tank, America built 5. For every Japanese plane, the Allies built 10. It was an avalanche of steel, unstoppable, overwhelming. The tide of war was shifting not just on battlefields, but in factories, homes, and hearts. Victory was being forged in silence, in the clang of hammers, the roar of furnaces, the rhythm of machines. But while workers built weapons of war, others fought a different battle. In shadows, in forests, in occupied cities, ordinary men and women rose against tyranny. They were not soldiers, but partisans, spies, and rebels. The resistance was stirring, and their war was just as deadly. Across Europe, the swastika flew over capitals. Paris, Warsaw, Oslo, Athens. Cities that once bustled with freedom were now choked by jackboots. The Nazi grip was suffocating, enforced with fear, propaganda, and cruelty. Curfews, arrests, public executions. Entire communities lived under the shadow of occupation. But in the silence, resistance stirred. It began small: whispers, leaflets, graffiti scrawled on walls. "Death to Hitler." Then it grew bolder. Trains derailed. Bridges blown. Messages smuggled through coded letters. Across occupied Europe, ordinary men and women became soldiers in secret, waging war not with armies but with courage. In France, the resistance was born. Underground newspapers defied Nazi censors, spreading truth where lies ruled. Networks formed, smuggling downed Allied pilots across borders. Saboteurs struck factories, slowing German production. Every act risked death. The Gestapo hunted relentlessly. Caught resistors were tortured, executed, or sent to concentration camps. Still, they fought on. In Poland, resistance was fierce and unrelenting. The Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, organized sabotage and intelligence gathering. Underground schools kept Polish culture alive under Nazi attempts to erase it. The Warsaw Ghetto saw desperate uprisings, Jews armed with little more than pistols and Molotov cocktails, fighting SS troops with tanks and flamethrowers. They knew they could not win, but they fought for dignity, for defiance. The cost was staggering, but their courage echoed through history. Elsewhere, Norway's resistance struck hard. When the Nazis sought heavy water for atomic research, saboteurs destroyed the Vemork plant in a daring raid, crippling German nuclear ambitions. In the Netherlands, citizens risked everything to hide Jewish families from deportation. And Frank's diary would later become the immortal testament of that struggle. Greece, Yugoslavia, and the Balkans erupted in partisan warfare. Mountains became sanctuaries for guerrilla fighters, striking convoys, ambushing troops, melting back into the countryside. The Nazis retaliated with brutality. Villages burned, civilians executed as collective punishment. Resistance was survival, and survival was resistance. The Soviet Union's vast lands bred their own shadow armies. Partisans in forests and swamps waged relentless war, blowing up railways, harassing supply lines, tying down entire German divisions. They lived in harsh conditions, hunted daily, but they were vital, the hidden knife at the Wehrmacht's back. Even in Germany itself, whispers of dissent remained. The White Rose, a group of students in Munich, distributed anti-Nazi pamphlets. They were caught, executed by guillotine, but their message lived on. We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace. Spies worked in silence too. Networks like Britain's Special Operations Executive sent agents behind enemy lines. Parachuting into occupied lands, they trained resistance fighters, passed intelligence, coordinated sabotage. Many never returned, captured and killed, but their impact rippled across the war. Resistance was not only about sabotage. It was about hope. Every act, no matter how small, reminded occupied nations that tyranny was not absolute. A Nazi officer's car bombed. A train delayed. A message scrawled in defiance. These gestures carried weight far greater than their scale. They told civilians, "You are not alone." The cost was immense. For every act of rebellion, the Nazis struck back with terror. Entire towns executed for one assassination. Families deported for hiding Jews. Children shot for carrying leaflets. Occupied Europe lived in constant fear, but also constant defiance. And resistance mattered. Intelligence from occupied lands guided Allied strategy. Sabotage slowed German industry. Guerrilla warfare tied down thousands of troops who could have fought at the front. By 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, resistance fighters rose in open revolt, cutting German communications, guiding Allied troops, attacking supply convoys. Their war in the shadows became war in the open. It was a different kind of courage. Soldiers on the front fought with rifles and tanks. Resistance fighters fought with secrecy, with silence, with their lives hanging by a thread every day. Many did not live to see victory. But without them, victory might never have come. The war was not only decided by grand armies, but by whispers in the dark, by footsteps in alleys, by rebels who chose to resist in the face of death. And while Europe's shadows burned with defiance, the Allies prepared to strike. The factories of victory had forged the weapons. The resistance had weakened the occupiers. Now the Allies would turn from defense to offense. The tide of war was turning. And soon the counterattack would begin. The Desert War was over. North Africa was won. The Axis armies there had been crushed, their survivors marched into captivity. For the Allies, the Mediterranean was now open. The question was clear: where to strike next? Churchill called it the soft underbelly of Europe. Italy, the ancient land of Rome, now shackled to Mussolini's fascism, would be the next target. To Hitler, Italy was an ally. To the Allies, it was the weakest link. The invasion began in July 1943. Operation Husky. Allied forces surged across the sea and landed on Sicily. It was one of the largest amphibious assaults yet. Hundreds of thousands of men storming the beaches, supported by waves of aircraft and naval gunfire. The Germans and Italians resisted fiercely, but the Allies pushed inland, fighting through towns, hills, and scorching heat. For Mussolini, it was disaster. His regime, already shaken by defeats in North Africa, began to crumble. Italians had grown weary of war, weary of poverty, weary of watching their sons die for a dictator's dreams. In Rome, discontent boiled. In July, as Sicily fell, Mussolini was deposed by his own council. Arrested, the Duce, who once boasted of a new Roman Empire, was now a prisoner. The news electrified the world. Italy, the first fascist state, was collapsing. But Hitler refused to let it go quietly. German divisions poured into Italy, seizing control, fortifying defenses. The fight for the peninsula had only begun. In September 1943, the Allies landed on mainland Italy at Salerno. The Germans struck back hard, counterattacking with panzers, nearly driving the Allies into the sea. But the beachhead held. Soon more landings followed. Taranto, Naples. Italy's surrender was announced, but the war in Italy was far from over. The Germans transformed the peninsula into a fortress. Defensive lines crisscrossed the mountains, rivers, and valleys. The most infamous, the Gustav Line, anchored by the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino. From its heights, German guns commanded the valleys below, turning every Allied advance into a bloodbath. Winter set in. The Italian campaign became grinding brutal. Mud-swallowed tanks. Rain-soaked trenches. The Allies fought village by village, ridge by ridge. Monte Cassino was bombed to rubble, yet the Germans clung to its ruins, turning stone into stronghold. Meanwhile, Hitler had not forgotten Mussolini. In a daring raid, German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny rescued the fallen dictator from captivity, spiriting him away to the north. There, Mussolini became the puppet ruler of the so-called Italian Social Republic, propped up by German bayonets. But his power was a shadow. Italy was a battlefield, its people caught between occupiers, partisans, and invading armies. By mid-1944, Rome fell to the Allies. Crowds cheered in the streets as Allied tanks rolled past the Colosseum. For the first time since the war began, a capital of the Axis had been liberated. Yet the fighting in Italy dragged on, brutal and unforgiving, until 1945. The mountains and rivers turned every mile into blood. For the Allies, Italy was not the soft underbelly Churchill imagined. It was a grinding war of attrition. But it had strategic value. It drained German forces, diverted divisions that could have fought in France or Russia. And it proved that the Axis could be toppled. Italy had fallen. Mussolini's empire was in ruins. But the true storm was still to come. Because across the Channel, a greater invasion was being prepared. An armada unlike anything in history. The liberation of Europe would begin not in the south, but in the west. And the beaches of Normandy waited. Night, June 5, 1944. The English Channel churned with ships. Thousands of them. An armada of steel stretching to the horizon. On their decks stood soldiers, Americans, British, Canadians, Poles, Free French, all waiting silent tense. The greatest invasion in history was about to begin. For months, the Allies had prepared. Operation Overlord. The plan to storm Nazi-occupied France and open the Western Front. Deception was everywhere. Fake armies built of wooden tanks and dummy planes tricked the Germans into expecting an attack at Calais. Meanwhile, in secret, the real invasion force gathered in southern England. Over 150,000 men. Nearly 7,000 ships. Thousands of planes. All aimed at one target, Normandy. As midnight struck, paratroopers jumped into the dark. The skies filled with the thunder of aircraft. Men dropped into fields, rivers, hedgerows scattered far and wide. Many drowned in swamps. Others landed directly in enemy fire. Yet they fought, capturing bridges, sabotaging rail lines, sowing chaos before the dawn. And then came the morning. June 6th. D-Day. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave hit the beaches. Omaha. Utah. Gold. Juneau. Sword. Names that would be carved into history. On Omaha, American troops stepped into hell. Machine guns tore through the surf. Shells exploded in water and sand. Men drowned under the weight of their gear. The beach was littered with bodies. For hours, it seemed the invasion might fail. But small groups of soldiers pushed forward, crawling, clawing, climbing cliffs under fire. One by one, they silenced the bunkers. Omaha held. Elsewhere, the landings surged with brutal force. Canadians at Juneau stormed inland despite mines and wire. British troops at Gold and Sword fought through strong points, linking up with airborne divisions. At Utah, currents pushed Americans off course, but it spared them the worst of defenses. By day's end, the Allies had carved a foothold into Hitler's fortress Europe. The cost was staggering. Nearly 10,000 casualties. Beaches soaked in blood. But it was victory. Behind the beaches, chaos reigned. Paratroopers, though scattered, tied up German reinforcements. Resistance fighters struck railways, ambushed convoys, guided Allied troops through fields and hedgerows. French civilians watched in awe as liberation arrived at last, their villages rumbling with Allied tanks, their streets echoing with the tramp of free men. Hitler had been deceived. He believed Normandy was a diversion, convinced the real attack would come at Calais. For crucial days, he withheld his armored divisions. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. The Allies were pouring in men, tanks, supplies, across the beaches now transformed into sprawling ports of war. The Battle of Normandy raged for weeks. Hedgerows turned the countryside into a maze of ambushes. German panzer divisions counterattacked fiercely. Villages became fortresses. But Allied numbers, air power, and sheer determination ground them down. The skies belonged to the Allies now. Bombers reduced German columns to twisted wrecks. Fighters prowled the skies, hunting anything that moved. In late July, Operation Cobra broke through. American tanks burst from the hedgerows, sweeping into open country. Patton's Third Army surged forward like a tidal wave. German forces reeled, retreating toward the Seine. In August, Paris rose in revolt. The resistance fought in the streets. When Allied troops entered the city, Parisians cheered, waving flags, climbing tanks, embracing soldiers. The swastika was torn down from the Eiffel Tower. France was free. D-Day had been the beginning, the breach in Hitler's fortress. From Normandy, the Allies would sweep across Western Europe, liberating nations one by one. But the price was written in blood on the sands. For the men who died on those beaches, it was the longest day. For the world, it was the beginning of the end. Hitler's empire was crumbling. 2 million Soviet troops pressed from the east. The Allies surged from the west. The Axis were being squeezed, crushed, forced back toward their heartlands. The end was coming. But before Berlin fell, before Hitler's Reich collapsed, the world would see horrors darker than any battlefield. The Holocaust was about to be revealed. Spring 1945. Europe was in ruins. The Reich, once triumphant from the Atlantic to the Volga, was now cornered. Allied armies closed in from west and east. Cities burned. Railways lay shattered. The Wehrmacht, once the terror of the world, fought desperately with dwindling fuel, starving men, and boys dragged from classrooms into uniform. Berlin, Hitler's capital, was the last fortress. And it was about to become the final battlefield. From the east came the Red Army, millions strong. Hardened by Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad, they marched with vengeance in their blood. Stalin's orders were clear. Berlin must fall to the Soviets, whatever the cost. Zhukov and Konev's armies surged across the Oder River, artillery thundering, shells screaming. The opening barrage shook the earth. Tens of thousands of guns firing in unison, turning German positions into dust. From the west came the Americans, the British, the French. Eisenhower's armies swept across the Rhine, tearing through what remained of German resistance. Patton's tanks roared into the heart of Germany, outrunning supply lines, smashing cities in their path. Allied bombers darkened the skies, reducing Hamburg, Dresden, and countless others to rubble. But Eisenhower made a choice. Berlin would be left to the Soviets. The lines were drawn for the world to come. Inside Berlin, the mood was apocalyptic. Civilians huddled in basements, clutching what food remained. Water came from bomb craters. The Gestapo still prowled, executing any who spoke of surrender. Hitler's speeches blared on the radio, promising phantom armies, miracle weapons that no longer existed. Reality was undeniable. The Reich was collapsing. April 16, 1945. The Battle of Berlin began. Soviet troops stormed across the Silo Heights, a brutal clash of men, tanks, and artillery. German defenses fought savagely. Hitler Youth with Panzerfausts, old men of the Volkssturm firing rusty rifles. But the Red Army was relentless. Street by street, block by block, Berlin was consumed. Flamethrowers cleared bunkers. Tanks blasted buildings to rubble. Snipers perched in ruins, dueling at point-blank range. The city became a furnace of blood. By late April, the Soviets encircled the capital. Berlin was cut off. Ammunition gone. Food gone. Hope gone. Yet the fighting raged on, as if the city itself refused to die. Shells fell endlessly. The nights glowed red. Civilians scurried through cellars as buildings collapsed above them. The smell of smoke, blood, and decay filled the air. Beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler remained in his bunker. Once a man of grand rallies, of fire and spectacle, now reduced to a trembling figure in the dark. His empire gone, his army shattered, his allies dead or captured. He raged at his generals, cursed his people, dreamed of vengeance that would never come. Outside, the Soviets were less than a mile away. On April 30th, as Soviet shells pounded the city above, Hitler ended his life. Beside him, Eva Braun, his new wife of mere hours, took poison. Their bodies were burned in the garden above. The Führer was gone, but the fighting did not cease. Berlin was still a battlefield. Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag, the symbol of Nazi power torn down at last. German soldiers surrendered in droves. Civilians, starving, broken, stumbled into the streets as conquerors poured in. On May 2, 1945, Berlin finally fell. Days later, in Reims and then Berlin again, the surrender was signed. The Third Reich was dead. Europe was free, but scarred beyond recognition. Cities in ashes. Tens of millions dead. An entire continent hollowed by war. For the German people, it was defeat and devastation. For the Allies, it was victory at last. For the Soviets, it was triumph and vengeance. And for the world, it was a turning point. The war in Europe was over, but the war itself was not. Far across the seas, Japan still fought on. Kamikazes dove into ships. Soldiers prepared for last stands. Civilians were armed with bamboo spears. The Pacific burned as fiercely as ever. The fall of Berlin was not the end. It was the beginning of the final act. And the world would soon witness horrors beyond the battlefield. The true scale of the Holocaust, and the fire from the sky that would bring the last empire to its knees. As the Allies closed in on Nazi Germany, they expected rubble, they expected resistance, they expected war's usual horrors. But what they found went beyond imagination, beyond cruelty, beyond words. The Holocaust. For years, whispers had circulated. Reports smuggled out of occupied Europe spoke of mass shootings, ghettos sealed with barbed wire, trains packed with human cargo that never returned. But the full truth remained cloaked in secrecy. The Nazis had hidden it well, until the liberators arrived. In April 1945, American troops stumbled upon Buchenwald. What they saw shocked them to their core. Emaciated figures, skin stretched over bone, eyes hollow, barely alive. Corpses stacked like firewood. Ovens still warm from the bodies burned within. Survivors staggered forward, some too weak to speak, some too broken to believe freedom had come. Other camps followed. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen. One by one, the gates were thrown open. Behind them lay the evidence of a machinery of death. Starvation, disease, forced labor, medical experiments. Children orphaned. Families torn apart. Mountains of shoes, glasses, and hair, collected from the dead, catalogued with bureaucratic precision. And then the greatest horror of all. Auschwitz. Liberated by the Soviets in January 1945, it was the epicenter of genocide. Over 1 million murdered there alone. Gas chambers disguised as showers. Crematoria belching ash that rained on nearby towns. Entire transports of Jews, Roma, and countless others herded from trains directly to their deaths. Mothers holding children's hands as they were led to delousing. Annihilation industrialized. The scale defied comprehension. 6 million Jews exterminated. Millions more Slavs, Roma, political prisoners, homosexuals, disabled men, women, and children. Any whom the regime deemed unworthy of life. The Holocaust was not chaos. It was not madness. It was systematic, planned, documented. The cold bureaucracy of murder on a scale humanity had never known. The world reeled. Soldiers hardened by years of combat wept openly at the camps. Generals forced German civilians to march through, to see the atrocities carried out in their name. No one would be allowed to deny what had been done. The survivors carried scars that would never heal. Tattooed numbers on their arms. Families erased. Futures stolen. Many weighed less than children, their bodies broken by hunger and cruelty. Yet even in their suffering there was defiance. They had lived. They had outlasted the Reich's attempt to erase them. The revelation of the Holocaust reshaped the world's understanding of the war. It was no longer just about borders or power. It was about survival itself. It was about confronting the darkest depths humanity could reach. The Nuremberg trials would soon follow. Nazi leaders stood in judgment, confronted with the evidence of their crimes. Films, documents, testimony. Some tried to deny, some to deflect, some to claim they were only following orders. But the evidence was undeniable. The world demanded justice, not vengeance, but justice. For the millions silenced, the guilty would answer. The Holocaust was the Reich's ultimate crime, its blackest legacy. And its memory would haunt generations. A warning carved in ash and blood. That hatred once weaponized can consume entire peoples. That silence in the face of evil is complicity. That humanity, if it forgets, is doomed to repeat. As the ovens went cold and the gates were opened, the war in Europe ended. But in the Pacific, the bloodshed continued. Japan still fought on with fanatic resolve. Cities burned. Soldiers dug into islands. Civilians prepared for last stands. The Holocaust unveiled the depths of human cruelty. The Pacific would unveil the heights of human destruction. Because the final chapter of this war would not be fought in trenches, nor cities, nor deserts, but in fire from the sky. August 6, 1945. A clear morning over Japan. The city of Hiroshima stirred awake. Children walked to school. Workers pedaled bicycles along narrow streets. Housewives prepared rice for breakfast. It was an ordinary day, until the sky delivered the extraordinary. At 8:15 a.m., a lone American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, appeared overhead. From its belly, it released a single bomb. Small, ordinary-looking. It drifted downward on a parachute, almost silent. And then in an instant, the world changed. A blinding flash, brighter than the sun. A roar that swallowed the earth. And fire, unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The bomb detonated with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. A searing sphere of heat vaporized everything at the epicenter. Buildings, trees, people, erased in a fraction of a second. Shadows burned into walls where bodies had stood. The blast wave flattened the city, tearing through wooden houses, shattering stone, hurling debris like missiles. Flames consumed what remained. Tens of thousands died instantly. Others staggered through the ruins, their skin burned and hanging in strips, their bodies broken. Rivers filled with the wounded, desperate for relief, but the water boiled with fire. Survivors wandered in shock, silent, ghost-like, their faces blackened, their eyes hollow. The mushroom cloud rose, towering into the sky, a pillar of smoke and ash that announced to the world the arrival of a new age. Nuclear war. By nightfall, Hiroshima was a ruin. A city of 350,000 reduced to ashes. Nearly 70,000 dead in a single day. Tens of thousands more would perish in the weeks to come, from burns, injuries, and an invisible killer, radiation. Hair fell out. Skin blistered. Internal organs failed. Doctors were powerless, overwhelmed, horrified. The bomb had a name, Little Boy. It was the first atomic weapon ever used in war. The decision had been made in Washington by President Harry S. Truman. The goal? To force Japan's surrender, to avoid a bloody invasion that might cost millions of lives on both sides. But the cost to Hiroshima was unimaginable. The city became a symbol, not just of destruction, but of the terrible power humanity now wielded. In Tokyo, leaders reeled. Yet still no surrender came. The military insisted on fighting. Kamikazes still dove at American ships. Soldiers still dug into bunkers. Japan prepared for a last stand, even as its cities burned under relentless conventional bombing. 3 days later, the world witnessed fire again. This time at Nagasaki. The atomic age had dawned, written in light, fire, and ash. The war was entering its final, devastating chapter. The question was no longer if Japan could hold out, but how many more would die before it fell. August 9, 1945. Nagasaki. Another bomb. Another flash, another roar, another city consumed. This time the weapon was called Fat Man, more powerful than Hiroshima's little boy. In seconds, 30,000 lives were gone. The fires spread. Survivors, already broken by years of war, stumbled through ruins that no longer resembled a city. And then silence. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across Japanese radios. For the first time, his people heard their godlike ruler speak. His words were measured, archaic, indirect, but the meaning was clear: Japan would surrender. The war was over. 6 years. 60 million dead. Cities leveled. Nations scarred. Families shattered. The Second World War had ended, not with peace talks in gilded halls, but with firestorms, genocide, and the birth of nuclear terror. In Europe, the victors surveyed a continent in ruins. Berlin a carcass. Warsaw a wasteland. London battered. Paris scarred. From the ashes, millions displaced, millions hungry, millions searching for homes that no longer existed. Across the east, Soviet armies occupied half the continent. A new Iron Curtain descended, dividing Europe into spheres of influence: West and East, democracy and communism. The seeds of a new conflict, the Cold War, were already being sown. In Asia, Japan lay shattered. Its cities flattened by bombs, its empire dissolved. American troops occupied the nation, dismantling its war machine, rewriting its constitution, bringing reforms but also the shadow of humiliation. China, once ravaged by Japan, was left devastated, torn between nationalists and communists. The Pacific Islands, once bloody battlegrounds, now stood as graves for tens of thousands. For survivors of the Holocaust, liberation did not mean peace. They wandered through camps and ruins, searching for families who no longer existed. Many found only silence. Entire communities erased. The world, shocked by the horror, vowed never again. Yet the scars ran deeper than promises could heal. The United States emerged transformed. Once an isolationist nation, it was now the world's foremost superpower, armed not just with fleets and factories, but with the bomb. The Soviet Union too stood tall, its sacrifices immense, its influence vast, its Red Army stretched across half of Europe. The balance of power was shattered, rebuilt, and sharpened into a new rivalry. And in the quiet of Hiroshima's ruins, in the silence of Auschwitz's ashes, the world understood. War had changed forever. This was no longer an age of cavalry charges or trench lines. This was an age where entire cities could vanish in a single flash. An age where ideology could justify extermination. An age where survival itself was uncertain. Yet even amid the wreckage, humanity endured. Soldiers came home. Families rebuilt. Nations rose from rubble. Children played among ruins, laughter echoing against walls scarred by shrapnel. Life pushed forward, defiant. World War II was the deadliest conflict in history. A story of destruction, cruelty, and darkness, but also of resilience, courage, and survival. From the snows of Stalingrad to the sands of El Alamein, from the skies over London to the beaches of Normandy, from the jungles of Burma to the ashes of Hiroshima, it was a war that engulfed the world and changed it forever. It ended with a whisper on the radio, a mushroom cloud in the sky, and a silence that carried both relief and dread. The war was over, but the world it left behind would never be the same.